your PowerPoint slides and not against you, but just as a reference point. Under risks, you mentioned arrogance and insensitivity. That's one of the risks you run in moving to the national regulator. In development of policy, mitigating that risk is through broadening the scope of people who you consult with when you're making regulations, making policy. The expert panel suggested the development of a small issuer panel and a consumer panel, and I think that does go to the idea of mitigating those risks. My question is, at the level of the consumer versus the producer, the manufacturer of the product, you have the advisor. I noticed in the expert panel there was the absence of an advisor panel. I was wondering if you could comment on what your thoughts would be about the inclusion of that sort of panel. And secondly, if the new regulator would be adopting that sort of procedure of having the various panels to get more input, would you view that as a legislative requirement or an administrative requirement?
That's an excellent series of excellent questions. Excuse me while I disappear. The concept of panels are a difficult one because it raises the question you probably didn't even intend to ask, or raises the answer that it gives rise to a great slippery slope. Why is it that one priority is given a status above the other? And now I say that with probably the exception of one, and that's the investor panel. I think it's pretty recognized that investors, particularly retail investors, have not had an adequate opportunity to have the same kind of input into policy making as other market participants. And that clearly has to be remedied. One of the things that we are looking at is the Hawken recommendation of having a statutory investor panel. In terms of the other areas, we're open to that, although I think we are also looking at other ways to have meaningful input from constituencies in the market without necessarily bringing it into a statutory framework.
Going back to the issue of arrogance, the question is this, and I'd like to frame it from the viewpoint of an advisor from the street level. I deal with the middle class and the somewhat poor. I'd like to say that in 1995, if your son or daughter in their 20s came in to see me with a $5,000 RSP contribution, the discussion and paperwork would take 15 minutes. It would take 15 minutes for the dealer to process the paperwork. Today, and I'm not kidding, I've done surveys with the colleagues, that same contribution takes 4+ hours, not counting the dealer. I look like and it looks like it's heading to 8. Now, one of the problems with regulation, and I understand all good and well that you're trying to level the playing field, but there is something that government seems to be blind to, which is the law of unintended consequences. The more you regulate our industry, the less you make advice available to the very people who need it. To what degree are you, as regulators, cognizant of this? And I can go into some discussions that I've had with Mr. Brown when he was head of the OSC during the time when I was a dealer and I was told to get out by the OSC, and when he was introducing the MFDA through roadshows to dealers, and I posed this dilemma to him. And I don't see that governments are taking account of or responsible for the law of unintended consequences. So, any comments?
The question of regulatory burden is a huge one, and it's not just on the advisor side. I mean, we've heard it a lot about imposition on the issuer side with IFRS coming in and corporate governance changes, et cetera. We hear it all the time. You raise a very good point, which in my view highlights the importance of getting it right. And the important aspect of getting it right, and let me just take a step back and emphasize that, you know, in this role, I'm no longer a regulator. I'm more of an advisor to the government. I hear what you're saying, and our office is there to build a structure that can accommodate all of the goals and objectives, and clearly the issue that you have raised is a goal and an objective, and that is how do you reduce the regulatory burden so that clients and investors are best served. And so different layers of regulators and different the need to deal with different people around the table, whether they're SROs or whether they're each regulator with their own local rules, is something that we can address. Now, I can't tell you now whether the new regulator will necessarily come out with this policy or that policy, but there has to be a way to allow and encourage people like you, market participants, important market participants, to have an effective and listened to voice in terms of how regulation is achieved. One of the things I should also say that the Hawken Committee did recommend, and the approach that the office is following in terms of the recommendation, is to have a much more outcomes-based approach to regulation. And that is so that we don't get overly caught up in form over substance.
Can I just make a follow-up? As an observation, at the delivery end of the blunt instrument called regulation, if you look at what the OSC talks about and what they inspect, because I've done management consulting, you always look at what a management inspects, not what they say. And I'll tell you, the only thing they inspect is the transaction. If I do not cross the T's and dot the I's, I can lose my license for something that frankly is not material. And that model of regulation hasn't changed in 75 years in this country and is getting more entrenched. And unless you change that culture and make it more fiduciary, which you talked about, both sides, you talked about it when it's not complete, it's not. Unless that culture changes, we are in deep doo-doo. Frankly, you know, it's really an option to say, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm going to Costa Rica. There's no regulation there. And unfortunately, that's not an option for people who don't have money. And those are the ones that we're trying to help. That's part of the problem.
The point that I certainly will pick up and emphasize is that a lot of these issues are a question of culture. I agree with that. And this is a great opportunity, without commenting on past culture, which I'm not going to do, but this is a great opportunity to create a culture of the kind that you're talking about, something that is outcomes based, that is willing to roll up its sleeves and to recognize objectives as opposed to form over substance.
I came here today based on the really the promotion of the day that change is coming, and show up and find out what it is. So I followed your presentation and really have more questions than answers. And I'm looking for specifics. So maybe the specifics aren't finalized yet, but I'm looking at your bio and your background and sort of what you've done to date within the industry. I'd like to hear specifics